This room is dedicated to the theme of lowering barriers for emotional support animals. Many of us in our work have come to recognize requesting a reasonable accommodation for emotional support animals as a tool for keeping people and animals together in a generally non-pet friendly system. Unfortunately, even though emotional support animals are protected in shelter and housing by the Fair Housing Act, the processes can be cumbersome and wide open to interpretation by landlord or property managers. Oftentimes, these processes become barriers to sheltering people and animals together. Today, we'll hear from 3 experts in this field and how they navigate these systems to advocate for their clients. First up, we'll hear from Philip Tedeschi on clinical consideration for persons experiencing homelessness, pet prescriptions, and ESA considerations. Philip Tedeschi is a clinical professor at the University of Denver Graduate School of Social Work and executive director of the Institute for Human-Animal Connection, an internationally recognized center for the study of the interrelationship and health of people, animals, and the environment through the lens of the social sciences. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, if that's okay. And we'll just go ahead and we'll get started. Let's see here. Okay, let's see here. Are you able to see this? I don't think you are, right? Yeah.
We are not seeing your screen.
Okay, let me try this again here. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Well, greetings, everybody, and hello to my friends and students and colleagues from Colorado and the Denver area. I see several of you are here, so welcome. Glad you could join us today. I'm a clinical social worker here in Colorado and also a faculty member at the Graduate School of Social Work. And my primary activities at the School of Social Work has been the directing of an institute called the Institute for Human-Animal Connection, and I'll invite you to get to know us better. But today I wanted to talk to you a bit about some of the work I've been doing at the university over the last several years, and wanted to start talking about this really through the lens of the fact that I think often the concept of emotional support animals often really gets shortchanged and misrepresented. And the reason that you see this unusual picture of a turkey, this is actually a picture I took outside of my window here in Colorado, but there was a story about somebody who brought a turkey on an airplane. And then that became kind of the media vantage point of this story. And frequently the media fails to really tell the deeper story around the importance of animals as supports for human health. So I wanted to talk to you about our experiences in that and then invite broader conversation the rest of the afternoon and evening, because it has significant relevance to supporting persons remaining with their animals, and yet it still remains often quite misunderstood. I'm having a little trouble here with advancing. Okay, so hang on a second. I'm going to stop sharing here. I'm already having some tech issues, so not sure what is going on here, but
I do have your slides on my computer. If you would like me to share.
Yeah, I guess we're going to have to do that. I'm not sure
Okay.
what's going on, but
let me pull that up.
I guess I'll need to have you do that. So sorry about that, everybody. So while this is coming up, I'll just tell you that one of the elements of my work at the University of Denver has been the supervision of the emotional support animal program at the university. And the result of that was that we've really learned a lot about the significance of emotional support animals in that context, and then have worked in a broader context with the city of Denver to begin to explore the importance of these topics. So thanks very much for pulling these up. All right, we can just fast forward to the next slide. There we go. So the first thing I think is just to recognize, and as this conference has done so beautifully, explain the fact that there are animals in our lives, both in the lives of everyday households, and also in a large number of the persons who are experiencing homelessness. These relationships serve as some of the most important and reliable relationships that we really have. We also know that the presence of an animal can at times create barriers to receiving services. That was just discussed in a number of different contexts today. But primarily, this really can impact somebody's ability to find healthcare, transportation, shelter, housing, and food services, and many other elements of it. Also, the other thing that we have found in our work is that because the emotional support animal guidelines are not well understood, often persons who are homeless and have animals with them experience stigma, and often really negative comments, often suggesting that the animal's care is going to be inadequate, or that somehow their health is in jeopardy. And in fact, we have found that not to generally be the case. Although there are some very specific reasons why healthcare settings and shelters and housing facilities need to pay attention to the inclusion of animals in these settings, often these concerns reflect uninformed perspectives on the risks associated with incorporating animals into these settings. One of the other things that we've seen and heard here in the Denver area is that persons are nervous about leaving their animals even for short periods of time, because often that animal will be taken from them, and they may have difficulty gaining access to that animal. So in many cases, these are some of the other things that serve as barriers. And then lastly, our work at our institute, where we've been studying the human-animal bond, really underscores this importance of this relationship. Okay, so let's keep going then to the next slide, please. So the process that we use at the university is, this is a kind of a shortened version, but I'll just run through it quickly, is usually that there's an initial request. There is then a recognition of a formal diagnosis. This is done through a disability assessment. We always then review the types of animals that are considered assistance or service animals to ensure that the recipient really is clear about their request. Then we complete an ESA evaluation. We review and consult with those individuals in their dwelling, and then we write a letter, and I'll give you an example of what a letter sounds like. And then we do ongoing care, because typically these letters are valid for a period of about a year. Okay, next slide, please. So the initial request, generally, I think the importance of the ESA guidelines, which emanates from the Americans for Disability Act, needs to start with a recognition of a trauma-informed lens. And unfortunately, in our society and the way it's been covered, often it's being framed as somebody who's already engaging in problematic choices or fraudulent behavior, or doesn't have a legitimate reason, which, in and of itself becomes, a framework that's quite problematic. So this trauma-informed lens would provide us the recognition that we may be talking to somebody who has relatively low trust in the healthcare system to begin with. So, and this is exacerbated by often city services and other settings when an ESA is requested, because in a lot of cases, they're just simply not being responded to at all, or kind of blown off. They're just not taken seriously or seen as fraudulent. Now, we've written over 42 of these letters just in the last about year and a half. And in only one case did we find there to be a reason that this was not a legitimate request, that in many cases, the individuals needed additional services, that they needed actually to consider things like a psychiatric service dog. But in very few cases are we finding individuals that are engaged in fraudulent activity. So one of the things we want to make sure we're doing is informing the client, making sure that they know the nature of the ESA evaluation process and they know what goes into both this, including the fact that we're required to make a diagnosis and provide an assessment. And that's part of the necessary kind of criteria for ensuring that individuals are fully informed. Okay, next slide, please. So ESA evaluations require a formal diagnosis. These can impact persons because they become part of a health record. So we always want to make sure individuals recognize that there are some implications for receiving a diagnosis. But we also want to recognize that these diagnoses are often can be beneficial for them, right? That can allow them to actually be considered eligible for an ESA evaluation as well. So we want to take time to explain that. These are done through a DSM-5 diagnosis, and often the World Health Organization's assessment scales can be helpful in accomplishing this as well. Next slide. So we usually talk about there being 3 types of animals that are often mistaken or confused. Service animals that are given the certification and allowed to have public access. Therapy animals that are generally invited into various kinds of settings, but do not have public access, and ESAs. All 3, let's say, if we're looking at all 3 of these as dogs, let's say, you might see all of them wearing a vest, and it can provide a lot of confusion. Vests, by the way, are not required for any of these categories. Neither is signage, but there's no requirements for that to occur. So people get confused about what we're talking about when we talk about these 3 areas. Service animals are covered by the Americans for Disability Act, and it's not the animal that is provided that accommodation for public access, it's the disability. So if I handed you this dog and I have a disability and you don't, that dog does not give you the ability to take that dog with you, let's say, into a public environment. Therapy animals are also not regulated, and generally speaking, we're looking for permission to bring a therapy animal into those particular settings. And in ESA, the limitation is only related to housing. There's been some recent changes in the way ESAs are being managed through the Air Carrier Act, which would be worth taking a look at if you're not familiar with those changes. I'm not going to try to go into that today, but only to say that ESAs are covered under the Fair Housing Act. And the way we want to think about that is that somebody without a disability can benefit from a dwelling. And the way the Fair Housing Act is designed is that somebody with a disability should be allowed to benefit from that same dwelling in the same way, if the presence of an emotional support animal allows them to do that, and they meet the criteria for a prescription, then they're eligible to have a prescription that allows them that benefit or that accommodation. Generally speaking, we work with a lot of detail on things like what it means to have an animal in your life, looking at the care of the animal, and the details that go into the fact that animals become a major responsibility, live with you for long periods of time, and require adequate attention. This is an important element in part because an animal that's not healthy or not flourishing is less likely to provide the emotional support or the health promoting benefits that we've seen. Next slide. So we usually review a handout with them. We identify the disability. We want to be able to directly answer a question as to whether this animal is necessary for the person to benefit from this equal opportunity or this particular dwelling. We also want to look at whether functioning can be improved by the presence of the animal. And now one of the areas that often doesn't get talked about directly in ESAs is that we have significant information, in particular the new information on the neurobiology of the presence of animals in our lives that we know impacts our unique functioning. And so often what we will do is try to address that as a part of a question in an ESA, or at least provide references to the research and the literature that identifies these benefits. Okay, next slide. One of the areas that continues to be critiqued about ESAs is the presence of online ESA providers that will then allow for a online form to be filled out and then a card to be received or something like that. One of the ways the law is written is that this is an individual that should be familiar to us. So one of the critiques or the things that often would be a rationale for considering something fraudulent or less authentic would be if that person really was not known to the provider writing and or providing that letter. That doesn't mean that that person has to be your client, but you would want to be in communication with that therapist who is caring for that client. So you're doing that through an official release of information. We look at corroborating information. We want to make sure that we're providing this individual a legitimate clinical evaluation when we're doing an ESA prescription. Lastly, I mentioned this already, we want to make sure that there's a safety plan, a care system in place. And the research in this area, and this has been talked about a bit yesterday with Leslie Irving, was also that animals that we are seeing in the lives of persons experiencing homelessness in many cases are functioning well, even though often that's not the perspective of our society's judgment on these issues. But what we're finding is that these animals really do have the ability to be properly cared for. But we want to emphasize this in all ESA considerations. Okay, next slide. So this is what goes into the letter, just a review, and then let's just take a look at the letter itself here. So next slide, please. So this is an example of a letter, and you'll notice that we're writing, as a feature of this letter, identifying the fact that this person is in professional care, that we're intimately familiar with that person's history. We then identify the fact that there is a disability recognized under the Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. That we also identify the fact that that mental health condition or the diagnosis impacts that individual, and that the presence of an animal helps alleviate or reduce the symptoms of that particular disorder. In this particular case, you can see we go on to talk about the fact that the presence or supportive environment also plays a significant role. So at least, let's say at the university, we may directly address the fact that the health and well-being of this client is supported by persons who will provide feedback for how that's going and provide a useful and supportive partnership in the implementation of this ESA prescription. And then at the last part, we reference the fact that there is significant body of literature and can be referenced. And generally speaking, we may even send them a set of resources, including specific literature that underscores how this animal might benefit somebody with this particular diagnosis. Okay, next letter or next slide. So we also want to provide, if we can, ongoing support. This is one of the things that we've found to be really valuable in making these work well, is to ensure that we're getting feedback and information earlier, problem solving things that might come up. The way these guidelines are written is it's really the federal guideline intention that these are accommodations, so that if there is a conflict, something like somebody with an allergy who doesn't want that animal around, somebody who's afraid of animals, those sorts of things, those are intended to be problem solved with and are not reasons to withdraw or deny this accommodation. They're intended to be problem solved with recognition that this individual has the right to have this animal present with them. Now, there are some conditions under which an animal could be removed or asked to be removed, and that would be if they're being very destructive or dangerous. Those would be circumstances under which there would be legitimate reason to remove an animal. But they're not, things like not liking animals, thinking they're dirty, opinions about, kind of general opinions or those sorts of things are not considered reasons to not approve these accommodations. Okay, next. Lastly, just attention to the fact that I mentioned the animal's well-being, what we sometimes refer to as the 5 freedoms, are important to consider. We will not generally write a letter if we believe the animal's welfare is in jeopardy. And under those circumstances, then we would really want to work carefully with that individual to ensure that their relationship with their animal does include good welfare practices, safety plans for proper care and support, and addresses the 5 freedoms. Okay, lastly, there are reasons at times why animals' behaviors will change. And I just wanted to mention this because for a lot of persons who write emotional support animal prescriptions, one of the areas that we've found that people are uncomfortable with doing so, practitioners are uncomfortable with this, is that they don't feel like they have enough knowledge about animal behavior to safely do this. And there's, and that's understandable. So in our program at the University of Denver at the Graduate School of Social Work, where we run a program where students are gaining an MSW and then a specialization in the incorporation of animals, we really believe that these are competencies and skills that can be built into the skill set of a practitioner who's writing these evaluations. So these are areas of knowledge, much like any other area of clinical evaluation or knowledge. We can consult with veterinary care professionals and other animal behavior specialists to make these determinations. It does not, and unfortunately, there are very few programs, very few schools of social service or social work that teach practitioners how to do these evaluations. And as a result, a lot of our jurisdictions and city services and places that should routinely be providing support through of ESA evaluations are unwilling to do that, in part because they just don't have practitioners who feel comfortable doing it. So we need to change that. I believe that these are things that we can build into the practice skills of a lot of our specialists that are working with persons experiencing homelessness, and it's really an added tool. All right, that's it, I think. Please feel free to reach out. I'll put in the chat my email, and you can get more familiar with our program. If you want to look us up, we're at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection at the University of Denver.
That was great. Thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you.
All right, I'm sure people have a lot to think about and probably have a lot of questions. Similar to other session blocks, we are going to save the questions till the end for the last 15 minutes or so, but we will ask you to put those in the chat box. Next up, we have Dianne Prado, who will be speaking to us about dismantling barriers for tenants and their companion animals. Dianne Prado is the founder and executive director of the Housing Equality and Advocacy Resource Team, HEART LA, a legal nonprofit that helps ensure people and their pets remain housed. Dianne combines her passion and training by advocating for people and pets in underserved communities, ensuring health and safety while fighting to address and prevent homelessness. Dianne started her career as a staff attorney with the Eviction Defense Network, where she protected the housing rights of low-income communities. Dianne later joined Inner City Law Center in 2012, where she defended tenants in evictions and sued slumlords in affirmative litigation suits. While at Inner City Law Center, Dianne helped form the Pet Resource Center in Skid Row, creating a partnership with Downtown Dog Rescue to provide both resources to the Skid Row community for their pets and counsel, advice, and representation to the Skid Row community for housing-related legal issues. Welcome, Dianne.
Hi, thank you. Okay, everyone, you can hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Great. Let me start sharing my screen and present. Great. So thank you so much. And thank you, Philip. That was awesome. I'm like, I want to carry your talk everywhere. So let me just jump right on in. HEART LA, I founded and formed HEART LA about 3 years ago with our mission to keeping people and pet in our homes. It's a legal nonprofit that provides free legal services to tenants with pets to help them stay in their homes. So a lot of eviction prevention, eviction defense. About 30% of pets are surrendered to a shelter due to a housing issue. So that is why I founded HEART LA. So what are the barriers? Before we dismantle them, let's discuss them. So what I've discovered is that there's a lack of information. The legal system is a barrier, and then legislation and changing legislation. The first one is the lack of information. What information do we need and who needs it? And it's everyone. So more importantly, the tenants, working with animal rescue volunteers and staff, caseworkers, landlords and management. And one of the things we do at HEART LA is education and outreach. And so what's so great about this conference is that it's uniting all of us, different partnerships from the human services world, from the animal world, to create partnerships and collaborations. We work closely with an organization called Downtown Dog Rescue, also with Home Dog LA and Bark Avenue, who presented yesterday. And we also partner with local law schools and providing services to train local law students to be able to provide counsel and advice to tenants. In the time of COVID, we had to switch how we provide our services. Prior to COVID, what we would do is actually be at spay and neuter vaccine clinics. So when there was a monthly vaccine clinic, we would also provide housing rights information. And so it would be a booth that would be visited alongside the spay neuter or the vaccines, which was really great because we're bringing services to people that otherwise wouldn't even know that these services are available. So it's taking the services where the community is versus forcing the community to find legal services, which is scary because a lot of the times people are scared of attorneys. I'm like, I don't even like an attorneys and I am an attorney. And so what we had to change was we made this like a call-in. So they call into Downtown Dog Rescue's office. There's a Google sheet that is active that we see, and then we're able to call back the person and discuss with them their housing issue that they have. The second system, and the biggest one that's a barrier, is the legal system. So in Los Angeles County, 45,572 evictions were filed in 2019. In 2020, that reduced to 13,796, mostly because there was a 90% reduction of filings when evictions were truly prohibited. I make it a point to say truly prohibited because throughout the nation and even in the state of California, elected officials continue to say that there's a moratorium on evictions, and there is not a moratorium in evictions. Courts are still open and tenants are still being evicted every day. In Los Angeles County, the number of illegal evictions has rise about 80%. And like I said, courts are still open. Landlords can still file evictions and attempt to evict a tenant. There was a rule in specifically California for about 3 months. It was called Judicial Rule 1 from May to August that stopped courts from allowing from issuing what's called a summons. So landlords can proceed on the evictions, but that was stopped. And then we immediately saw about a 4% rise in October of evictions being filed. I just wanted to kind of show the overview of the California eviction process via visual. One of the things that I really wanted to stress is that a lot of tenants will receive some type of notice from their landlord, or they won't receive any type of notice, and just like a verbal call stating that the tenant, that they need to leave and they need to be evicted. In California and in most states, there needs to be a legal process that needs to be entered in order for a landlord to legally evict a tenant. It starts with the 3-day notice, but even if the tenant doesn't comply with that, or whatever notice, 30-day, 60-day notice, that doesn't mean that a sheriff is going to come out and evict that tenant after the expiration of that notice. There has to physically be a documentation filed in the courthouse in order to start the eviction process. Happy to answer more questions about that, but I just kind of wanted to lay out and have you see the process visually of what that looks like. And before I talk about fair housing laws, I also want to talk about different defenses that are available for tenants, because a lot of the times when we're talking about tenants with pets, we jump straight to the fair housing laws, but there are defenses even without discussing fair housing laws. And the reason that I bring this up, and I think that this is important, is because one, because of the abuse, I think at times that landlords are fearful of in terms of tenants getting support animals or assistance animals, and also because there's more defenses available for tenants. One of those being what's called waiver, or estoppel is a legal term for it. And what that means that if a landlord is continuously accepting rent with knowledge of the pet, they can't then evict that tenant for having that pet, because they've, through their conduct and through their actions, have accepted the fact that that tenant has that pet. Changing the terms of tenancies. We have a lot of tenants where new owners come in. They've had their pet before. The prior owner allowed them to have their pet. New owner comes in and says, I don't want you to have a pet. There's an asterisk there because a lot of different cities, particularly in the city of Los Angeles, we have rent control that offers stronger protections with tenants so that they can't change the terms of tenancy unilaterally. And then last, but not least, retaliation. Many times I have tenants and my clients that have asked for repairs. Recently, during the time of COVID, have had financial distress due to COVID. And the minute that they exercise their rights, the landlord then uses their pet as a vehicle to be able to evict them. And that is illegal. And so now jumping to reasonable accommodations. And I love that Philip was able to discuss the therapist and the ESA portion of this. Just real quick, what is a reasonable accommodation? It's a change, an adjustment in a rule or a policy. And specifically for tenants with pets, it's a change to the no pet policy. When can a tenant ask for a reasonable accommodation? When they have a disability that limits one or more of their major life activities, substantially refers more to the federal protections. In the state of California, it's limiting one or more major life activities. And just kind of have Philip discussed before, does that pet provide assistance, perform tasks, provide emotional support that alleviates one or more symptoms of that tenant's existing disability? And then the legal requirements that are kicked in once that person asks for that reasonable accommodation, has that support letter and provides that to the landlord. The landlord can't charge a pet deposit. The landlord can't charge an extra fee. They can't impose breed restrictions. They can't enforce their no pet policy. They also, what's not on here, can't require pet insurance. So there can't be any additional fees imposed on the tenant. No breed restrictions, weight restrictions. And it's what happens is that you engage in what's called the interactive process. So if the landlord doesn't feel comfortable with the reasonable accommodation request, they just can't outright deny it. They need to be able to have a conversation back and forth to be able to discuss why it is that they're uncomfortable with the situation or with the reasonable accommodation request. I wanted to point out that, as I said, that the legal system is a barrier because access to justice is a huge issue. There are legal services organizations that provide free legal services to tenants in general are at capacity. Health service providers are inaccessible, right? And so I love that Philip and that your program incorporates the pet aspect of that, because there are health service providers that are very weary of providing support animal letters, ESA letters. They are scared of legal liability. There's also tenants that are unwilling to seek healthcare assistance. They're scared. Tenants are scared to lose their housing and distrustful of attorneys. The lack of knowledge of legal rights. And then the two last one, although there's many more, is that there's a huge power imbalance between landlords and tenants, and a huge power imbalance between courts and unrepresented tenants. About 90% of tenants go unrepresented in court. The court system is an adversary system that is not built to create equity for those that don't have the power to be able to enforce that themselves. Property rights is something that is already structurally based in racism, and that power of imbalance of that the landlord has over the tenant is huge. And having an attorney to be able to represent and help that tenant enforce their rights, and not just an attorney, but community-based organizations, tenant-based organizations, to be able to empower the tenants in the community is really important for the tenant with the pet to be able to properly exercise their rights and also have access to justice and have representation at court or even beforehand. The last barrier is legislation. And first, I want to talk about successes in legislation. And we had Senator Hertzberg earlier talk about the successes in legislation in regards to pets and housing in California. I just also wanted to highlight that another thing that California has done is that all publicly financed housing, or what's called like HUD buildings, must allow one or more pets, which is great. And then specifically, recently last year, when we were enacting emergency tenant protection ordinances in LA City and LA County, we included through a lot of advocacy that a tenant cannot be evicted for a pet during the declared state of emergency, because as I'm sorry, I think my screen went away. Let me find that again. Because as we found during the emergency, many people started fostering pets, or they had family members that had to move in that perhaps had a pet. And we wanted to ensure that tenants that incurred that weren't going to be evicted because of the addition of their pet. And again, that's specific to LA City and LA County. Some insurance considerations. I get a lot of questions about insurance policies that have breed restrictions. There is guidelines stating that the burden is on the landlord and the insurance company, that if there is a person with a disability that is making a reasonable accommodation request, you can make a reasonable accommodation request to the insurance company. And it is the burden on the landlord and the insurance company to state that there is an undue financial burden, meaning that going to a different insurance company is going to cost a significant amount to the landlord in order to be able to deny that. But that must be substantiated with the insurance company. Also, if the insurance company has a policy that doesn't have an exception for an assistance animal, an investigation could be launched against the insurance company. So in terms of specifically support animals, emotional support animals and service animals, insurance companies still have to abide by fair housing laws. And this just is an illustration that it truly does take a village in order to be able to change policies, tracking stories, social media, joining advocacy groups, organizing. And I kind of want to talk at this moment a little bit about different coalition efforts that are a bit different than what it is in the animal rights world. There is a Runners' Right to Counsel coalition, not only in Los Angeles, but nationwide. This started in New York. And what that means is that it's legislation to guarantee that low-income tenants facing evictions have a guaranteed right to an attorney. So just like there are public defenders in criminal cases, there is a huge push and movement to be able to have tenants that are facing eviction to be represented for free to be guaranteed a right to representation. And so why I bring this here to this community, it's because we're all working together to be able to further legislation that helps tenants with pets. And this type of legislation, although it might not be on the radar of animal rights organizations, it inherently helps tenants with pets because 50% of renters in the United States have a pet. And to be able to guarantee an attorney for a tenant with a pet that's facing eviction is helping that person and it's helping that pet stay housed. There's also, organizations that Heart LA is part of called stayhousedla.org. If you are in LA based, stayhousedla.org is a great resource and a website for anyone, any tenant facing eviction or any type of housing insecurity. There's also an organization called Healthy LA. And again, I highlight these because we are bridging the gap between the animal world and the housing world or human services world. And so I want us to start thinking broadly about the coalitions that we're a part of and joining different efforts to be able to help one another to reach the goal of keeping people and their pets together. And this is just more of a roadmap of showing what it is that we're doing. I also want to be able to focus really quickly on community-based organizations and what's called organizing efforts. And I'm really proud that Heart LA works very closely with community-based organizations. And what this means, what community-based organization means is that it is organizations that literally have memberships from the community that they're helping. So tenants are members of that organization, participate in that organization in making and deciding what legislation is going to be important, deciding what changes need to be made, and what's important to that community. A lot of times, new attorneys ask me, I want to start doing legislation very quickly, or I want to start making policy change. And we don't know what policies are important to be changed unless we're talking to the community. And a lot of times, I see that people jump in with a great idea of what they think should be a policy change without actually talking to the community that's going to be affected. And it's really important to be able to be grounded and on the ground, speaking to those folks that are the ones that are going to be affected by the policy changes. As an eviction defense attorney for a long time, there had been numerous times where a policy is put in place that actually has no assistance or no help to eviction defense attorneys because no one spoke to us about whether or not that legislation was going to be helpful. And so we need to be really mindful of working with organizations that are on the ground, that are speaking to community members, and that we're listening to the folks that we are helping to hear from them and give them further power to be able to have their voice heard. And that's part of organizing, and that's part of working together with the community to make the changes that we need to make. And then lastly, I just want to end with everyone is deserving of a pet. I think that it has taken some time for all of us to reach the fact that, you know, a companion animal has a companion, which is their guardian. And in order to be able to help that companion animal, we need to be able to help that companion, their guardian. And by helping that person, we in essence help that pet. And we can't help the pet without helping the person. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm and then happy to answer more questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Diana. Your work is just so important, and I can tell in the chat box that everyone's really interested, and there are a few questions sitting there that we'll get to at the end. And if anyone hasn't asked a question and has one, certainly pop it in the chat now, or you can wait until the end. And last but certainly not least, we have a longtime friend of My Dog Is My Home, Steve Wayland from PAWS LA. Steve is with us today to talk about lowering barriers for emotional support animals. Steve Wayland is the program director for PAWS LA, a nonprofit organization that assists people living with disabilities and seniors to keep and care for their support animals. Founded in 1989, PAWS LA assists over 1,200 animals throughout Los Angeles County with pet food, vet care, and in-home assistance. Steve also oversees PAWS LA's housing information program, providing education, advocacy, and referrals to individuals facing housing challenges because of their support animal. Steve celebrates his 29th year with PAWS LA this year. A graduate of Occidental College, he shares his home with his rescue cats, Lillian and Zoe. Welcome, Steve.
I'm gonna try a trifecta. I'm gonna try to do a video, a slideshow, and not hang up on everyone. So
Okay.
Let's get started. I'm gonna share my screen. And how do I open that? Oh, there we go. How do I make it full screen?
One night out of the cold blue, I just hear this little horrible cat cry. She, that night, crawled onto my chest and purred me back to sleep and sunk from that moment forward. And for the next 21 years, she was a light in my life. Kept me from suicide many a time. Looking at that precious little soul in here, that purr. It's like she was telling me somebody loves you. When she knew I needed somebody most, she wouldn't let me be alone. She would not let me be alone. Couldn't be more happy with my animals. Really, when it gets down to the gritty of it, they are here because PAWS has made it possible for us.
Oh, yes. Okay. How do I get out of there? Well, I'll show that one. Okay.
She was my first shadow. Everything that you would want in a good.
Oh, there we go. All right. Am I still screen sharing?
I see just your camera now, not your screen.
How do I get it? All right. It'll be right there.
Okay.
Okay. Can you see it now? What is that?
Yes, I see it now.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I think this was so well timed because these three presentations are really more about beyond shelter when people are out in permanent housing, which obviously is the goal for all of this, all the shelter work that's being done. I have to say that things have changed so quickly, and it's amazing how much Los Angeles has jumped into the animal support shelter programs. It's pretty remarkable, and something that's happened really just in the last few years. So PAWS LA, we're in our 32nd year of service. We started as an AIDS service agency in 1989. And so most of our clients are people living with HIV and AIDS. Now, I know AIDS seems so yesterday. In the early 90s, when I started, about 40,000 Americans were dying from AIDS each year. Then some really great treatments have come up over the years. And so by 2018, only 15,000 Americans have died from AIDS each year. So it's not gone. It seems like it has because there's so many treatments, but it is still a significant health issue, and certainly worldwide, where 690,000 people died of AIDS last year. A lot of it in Africa and sadly in communities of color. But it is still here. It is still a pandemic, and it's still something that we're having to deal with. So about 70% of our clients are people living with AIDS. So we also assist other people with life-threatening illnesses and low-income seniors. And the services that we provide, pet food, vet care, in-home assistance, food delivery, dog walking, transportation to vets and groomers, and then our housing advocacy and education program. And these are just statistics about how many people we've assisted, or 1 million pounds of pet food we've donated to our clients. We have a weekly pet food bank for clients who are able to come into the office and to our food bank and collect a month's worth of pet food. If they are not, we have a team of volunteers that will make home deliveries to clients who are in need of their pet food assistance. Excuse me. And probably most significant to most people is the vet services or veterinary services we're able to provide. As you know, vet services are just going through the roof in terms of cost. So we work with about 15 veterinary hospitals throughout Los Angeles County, and they all provide their services at a discount. We aim for a 50% discount, and obviously we'll settle for whatever we get, but most of our vets do work between 30 and 50% off of their normal rates for our clients. And it's a really significant piece of the work that we do. And we estimate that 30,000 vet visits have been paid for during the agency's existence. So in 2000, we expanded from an AIDS service agency to also including people living with other life-threatening disabilities, MS, lupus, cancer, anything that would really debilitate someone and make it unable for them to live their life normally. And we provide the same services that we provide to our AIDS population: pet food, vet care, and all the support services that we have. And then in 2003, we expanded to assist low-income seniors. They don't have to be disabled, but low income and in need of assistance for their pets. We found that having been here from the beginning, when we were doing a lot of adoptions because our clients were dying. And we didn't set out to be an adoption agency. We were attempting to provide the services allow people to keep their pets. But they were dying, and we had to step in and do that. It was very clear that many of our clients did not have a support structure, that many of them were living alone. Their families had abandoned them. And so really the kind of community services that they were able to receive really made a difference. And we found that with the senior population, it's very similar. Many times they've outlived their loved ones, their spouse, their family, and their animal is the only source of love and support that they have. So we've been really happy to be able to step in and assist senior population. And I think I would estimate about 25% of our clients are seniors living in Los Angeles County. So since 1998, PAWS LA has been the recipient of HOPWA funds, Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS. It's a federal housing and support service program. When we applied, they had a category called Creative Services that Support Independent Living. And we felt that our program was appropriate and we were funded. We have since then, that's where we were able to develop our housing advocacy and education program was with our HOPWA funds and really make the agency really link to the housing piece in Los Angeles. And, you know, Los Angeles has a very unique housing situation. We're spread out over such a gigantic area, and it's very difficult to coordinate a lot of the different services. And we're the only agency, the only animal support agency in the country that receives HOPWA dollars, which we're proud of, but disappointed in that other communities have not been able to get the same assistance. HOPWA will not pay for pet food and vet care, but they do pay for case management. They do pay for our housing advocacy program. And it has made a huge, huge difference. You know, we were talking in our breakout earlier, and I said, politicians get the importance of animals a lot more than bureaucrats. During the 20 plus years we've been receiving HOPWA funds, twice the city has attempted to cut our funding, eliminate our program funding. But luckily, the people who make the decision are the city council, and we have been able to prevail and maintain our contract. It seemed particularly ironic at one point. Their argument for not funding us is that no one else funds this throughout the country, which seemed like a pretty weak argument. And again, we prevailed, and we're very, very proud to have the HOPWA program to buttress our service provision. By the way, we also applied for and received another HOPWA contract, which is not about animals, but it is the information clearinghouse for the county. It was being held and run by another organization that we didn't feel was doing a very good job. So in 2004, we received the clearinghouse contract, and we created the CHIRP LA program. And it has every kind of housing information and referral, permanent housing, emergency, temporary, Section 8. And by the way, all of that is available to anyone who wants to go and look at it. It's chirpla.org. There's a lot of housing information there. The one thing you can't access is the Section 8 listings that we find, because I was going to meetings and hearing people say, oh yeah, if you're looking at non-HIV, non-AIDS meetings saying, oh yeah, go to CHIRP LA and they've got these great Section 8 listings that you can use. And, you know, we get paid to provide those for our clients living with AIDS. And so we did have to password protect our Section 8 listings. So again, we're the only agency that gets those funding, and we're very proud of it. And it's made a huge difference in our ability to continue working to eliminate barriers for emotional support animals and for the disabled individuals who are on them. So then in 2008, that was 13 years ago. Now you have to understand, when I hear the housing shelter programs talking about the incredible animal friendliness that they have today, it's really incredible. Because back in 2008, although we had nothing to do with housing services, homeless services per se, we saw that no shelter in Los Angeles, let alone California, and we really couldn't find any shelters that had formal policies that allowed animals in the homeless shelter. And it was very frustrating. So we came up with the idea of what we called a shelter within a shelter. And it was a small structure down in the parking lot of Path Hollywood. And it housed 6 dogs and 6 cats, but those actually turned into small dog kennels because there weren't that many cats. But it was literally the first homeless shelter that had a formal policy of allowing pets. Now, I know that there's the emotional support animals and the service animals, and there are different laws that protect them. But a few years after 2008, I think it was 2011 or 12, the housing department was sued for violating the rights of disabled individuals who had service animals who were unable to get beds in homeless shelters in Los Angeles. And so, it's really a turnaround what has happened since then. And I know Anne English is in the other session, but she became the director of Path Hollywood shortly after we had gotten started working with Path Hollywood. We had found Petco Foundation donated $20,000 for us to get this started. And then the director of Path Hollywood resigned very suddenly, as far as we knew, it was sudden. And they hired this new person named Anne English, who, we'd already started this program. And so I met Anne at a meeting and she said, I really need to talk to you about this animal facility. And of course I thought, oh, here we go. Our priorities have changed. We won't be able to assist with that. And instead what Anne said was, this is one of the most exciting parts of taking this job is the animal support program. So she was obviously a huge part of the success of getting Petco Place off the ground. It took us a year. The building department had no idea what to classify this as, so they made it as hard as they could for us to get it permitted. The fire department actually said to us, we're only approving this because our supervisors told us we had to. So we said, we don't care, as long as you sign that piece of paper and we can open the shelter, which we did. And we got national coverage because it was a groundbreaking program. It was the first, what we called a shelter within a shelter, which we're now calling co-sheltering. But it really was the groundbreaking program of allowing pets into a homeless shelter. And I think it's clear that Path's success with Petco Place is a part of the reason that they've gone on to become so incredibly animal friendly, pet friendly in their programs. And so we're really proud of that. And it is just remarkable. It makes me feel incredibly old how things have changed from 2008 until today. But obviously it's thrilling that these changes have occurred. And again, we're really proud to have been a part of it. So just last thing about PAWS is we are expanding our program to include veterans with PTSD. It's another population that is underserved. There are a lot of programs throughout the country that provide animals to veterans. And they do training, and there are these amazing programs of veterans getting animals, but there's not so many that provide the follow-up resources, the food and the vet care and foster care, the other things that people need when they're struggling with health issues. I mean, a lot of these programs, you basically have to be wealthy enough to care for the animal because all they do is get you set up and then you're on your own, which is good for many, but it's not good for all. There's plenty of very low income veterans, especially the ones who are suffering from mental disabilities, who aren't able to afford the care of an animal ongoing. So it's just starting. We've just started it this year where, as with everything, it's a matter of finding appropriate funding, but we do have a few startup grants and are expecting to get that moving pretty fully during this next year. And again, very excited about that. And I did also want to mention that a lot of the services that we provide are only thanks to the volunteers that we have. We have around 200 volunteers. They provide the delivery of pet food. They work at our events. They walk dogs. They transport animals to veterinarian and grooming appointments. We calculate that our volunteers are the equivalent of 2 full-time staffers. And if we had to pay money for their volunteers, it would have been millions of dollars in salaries that we would have had to pay. But it's only because of the volunteers that we can provide the depth of services that we provide. Now, before I move on, I just want to remind people of the rule of 7. Have you heard that? You know, it's like it takes 7 times to hear things before they really sink in, because there's probably going to be some redundancy here. But if you've only heard it 6 times, this means you will never forget it. So it's proven that animals improve quality of life. And researchers at the State University of New York at Buffalo conducted research involving stockbrokers who were using medication to control high blood pressure caused by their stressful job. Half the stockbrokers were given a pet. 6 months later, the researchers put the entire group in simulated stressful situations. Those who had no pets showed a 30-point rise in their blood pressure. Those with pets showed only a 6-point rise and stayed within the normal range. And the researchers found that the benefits were equally good for men and women stockbrokers, regardless of whether they acquired a dog or a cat. The Journal of Personality and Social Psychology published a study of almost 1,000 elderly Medicare recipients and found that those with pets averaged 10% fewer doctor visits than those without pets. Dr. Judith Siegel of UCLA School of Public Health found in her study of men living with AIDS that those with a pet were half as likely to experience depression as those without a pet. And depression is a very significant part of disability. It's 17 million people suffer from depression, and it is the most common secondary condition and disability. And it's 10 times more likely in people. What is this? Sorry. Then there's many studies that show that social interactions are increased when there's an animal present. And we all know that just intuitively. Anytime you go outside, people are always excited, especially children, about your animal. And finally, a study conducted by Dr. Karen Allen examined the effects of the presence of pets and spouses on blood pressure and heart rate when couples were put under psychological and physical stress. It found that the lowest increase in blood pressure and the quickest recovery to normal levels was observed when only the pet was present, and the highest increase when only the spouse was present. My conclusion is pets are better than spouses. I know that not everybody might agree with that. So a recent study, now I want to move into the sort of the studies that prove the importance of housing. So we've seen the importance of animals, and we, again, just want to show a couple of studies that have indicated the importance of housing and health. So a recent study from the Center for Housing Policy documents that stable, affordable housing improves health outcomes for individuals with chronic illnesses and disabilities and the elderly by providing a stable and efficient platform for the ongoing delivery of health care and other necessary services. The National AIDS Housing Coalition studied the effects of stable housing on people living with HIV and found that homeless individuals living with HIV who were placed in supportive housing reduced AIDS mortality by 80% over 5 years. And additionally, it was shown that stable housing prevents new HIV infections by reducing risk behaviors by as much as 50%. So housing is an incredible component to moving through these pandemics and getting people healthy. Again, I think these are intuitively understood by all of us, but it's good to see that there's science behind it and studies that have proven it. And then a recent study from the Center for Housing Policy documents that stable, affordable housing improves health outcomes for individuals with chronic illness and disability and the elderly by providing a stable and efficient platform for the ongoing delivery of health services. So again, just really the connection of the importance of animals to human health and to housing and human health, and anything we can do to eliminate the barriers. You know, if we were to be asked, what one thing would you change? And Dianne sort of referenced it as well. What one thing could you change to improve the world of people and animals? and it would be to eliminate no pet housing. I know that's not going to happen, but as Dianne pointed out, it's one of the largest reasons that people relinquish animals to the shelter is having a housing issue, not being able to bring the animal with them. And it's that would solve so many things. So that's my wish list. So just very, very brief. I have a whole hours long slide on the human animal history back to the hunter-gatherer days. So I spared you that, but I did want to just sort of point out how we've gotten to where we are. And the first real service animal program was at the end of World War I, when dogs were formally trained to guide soldiers returning from the war who had been blinded in combat. In 1929, the first American guide dog training school was established, called the Seeing Eye. And then during the Second World War, the Army Air Force Convalescent Center in Pawling, New York, was the first in this country to experiment with what has since been labeled animal-assisted therapy. And Philip mentioned this, and it's been discussed in other sessions. Working with the Air Force Canine Corps, a German Shepherd puppy was trained to work in partnership with the center's medical teams. Dramatic improvement in outlook and morale amongst the soldiers was seen almost immediately. And then later, a more formal examination of the role that animals play in human health took place. And those are some of the studies that I've just referenced. And really, this was the introduction to the modern concept of the emotional support animal. It's proven that animals improve quality of life, and they don't have to be specially trained to provide that support. And so it's, to me, what sort of compels me is to understand that, when you see somebody at Home Depot, for example, with their dog, and you hear somebody say, oh, he's not disabled, or, oh, I have a new neighbor in my apartment building who claims to have an emotional support animal. They clearly aren't disabled. Know that person is either lying or is a psychic, because in fact, 10% of Americans suffer from what is known as an invisible disability, a disability that has no physical symptoms. So, there's a lot of conditions that don't have any physical manifestation, and you just don't know whether that person is disabled. And, it troubles me that there's too much supposition that everybody must be faking it just because they can bring their animal with them, when in fact, animals have been an incredibly important part of human survival and life since the very beginning. I mean, dogs were one of the first animals to be domesticated, and they were primarily for, some protection, some hunting. But as the men were off hunting and gathering, the dogs would be at home protecting the women and the children, as truly their one physical support. And of course, because of that, became an integral part of the family, because of the service they were providing. And truly, it was the beginning of what we now know as the incredibly important role that animals play in our lives today. All right, so then we developed our housing advocacy and information program. Again, there's so many legal resources, and Dianne is one of the best that are there to help people. In 1993 and 94, when we first started, and clients educated me about what the laws were. I wasn't aware of the fair housing laws. And we then went to some of the local legal service agencies and really didn't find the support that we expected to find. And so we developed our own information brochure, and it just helps explain the laws and the rights and responsibilities. So this brochure, you can find this on our website, pawsla.org, and it's just a guide that describes what the laws are, what your rights are, but also what responsibilities that you have. Now, these are the documents that have been talked about, and Philip showed a very detailed, comprehensive prescription letter. this is one we use. It's just very, very basic. You know, it's important for a doctor or medical provider not to provide too much information, because really it's none of the landlord's business. It's important that they know from a medical provider that you are a person living with a disability, as you have a condition that limits one or more major life activities, and that the animal provides assistance to you to help you live with your disability. So this is very helpful. And this, again, this is on our website. And then the request for reasonable accommodation, which is just the form, the legal form of requesting a change in the terms and conditions of the tenancy to allow you to have your medically prescribed support animal. So while I was listening to the presentation this morning, I got a call from a caseworker, because I'm at work. I mean, a lot of you are at home, but I'm at the office. And I took the call because it was from a caseworker who had a client who was in need of the prescription letter from a medical provider. And she was from a health organization. And I said, do they not have the client not have a health provider there? Yes, but our policy is we don't write those letters for our clients. And this is true at the public health authorities here in Los Angeles, and more of the agencies that are doing case management, who know very intimately the conditions of their clients, and yet are refusing to sign these letters, provide this very important document that will allow people into housing and to maintain their housing. And it really is that important. You know, in order to find housing with an animal, if the landlord says there's no pets, this is an important document, but it's probably more important if you're already living somewhere and the landlord decides they want to get rid of you. And, you know, as Dianne was mentioning, the excuses that they'll come up with, the pandemic being one, easy, convenient one, but it happens all the time. So this letter is vital to the health and well-being of a client. And I'm gonna just, because I can say it, I'm not an attorney, I think it's medical malpractice for these agencies not to work with their clients and provide them a simple statement that they're disabled and that an animal will provide support. They're not saying that a particular animal is going to be helpful and turns out that dog is vicious and it bites somebody. They're never going to come and sue them. It really is just a statement of fact that the person's disabled and that an animal would help them. And then from there, it has nothing more to do with the medical provider. There's as Dianne said, the interactive process that would begin with the landlord and the tenant to figure out how to best provide that reasonable accommodation. So I you know, with all the work that's gone into co-sheltering and how Los Angeles now has an incredible array of animal supportive and friendly housing options in shelters and temporary emergency housing. Now we have our clients unable to take that next step into permanent housing because they have this huge roadblock. And that's their medical provider will not sign the letter that will allow them to move forward. Now, the good news for our clients is we work with a therapist who will meet with them. It isn't like an online thing. You know, he will meet with the client and make an assessment and determine whether he believes that either the animal they have or just their general need for an animal is present, and provide them that letter. It costs us money to do it, but we're happy to do it. But it's just a shame that they aren't able to get that support from their own medical providers. It just doesn't seem right at all. I'm wanting to watch the clock. I think I will leave it there. I know that we've conquered the shelter co-sheltering issue since I began in 2008, when there was no one allowing any animals, to now having completely open animal-friendly shelters is just remarkable. So I know that we can take the next step and ensure that people looking for permanent housing are going to have the tools they need in order to secure that housing. And this is just the other part of our brochure with responsible animal guardians. And so that's my presentation. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak. And I think I have one. Oh, there's my Lily. That's Lillian posing. Okay, thank you so much.
Great, that was wonderful. Okay, so everyone was really great. You're all obviously doing really important work, and people are really interested in asking questions. So we now have about 15 minutes of joint Q&A. I am going to start off by melding together a few different questions that all seem to focus around ESA letters that came in during your talks. So this question is going to have a few different parts. Maybe you'll answer them and maybe it'll naturally evolve to answer all of them. So to start with, someone had asked Philip, your process or model of ESA evaluations, is that something that is available for people as a resource?
Yes, it is available. And in fact, we have a educational series that's available to people through our institute. And we provide, quite a bit of detail in terms of the ways that we go about doing it, including very specific questions that are part of the evaluation. And so if you'd like to reach out and contact me, I'll direct you in the right place so that you can get information about our ESA program and some of the other educational programs we have at our institute. So you can also directly communicate with our institute around our educational programs at the Institute for Human-Animal Connection.
Great, thank you so much. So there's that resource available, and Steve also, of course, has that form that he just shared for the accommodation request and the ESA letter template. Someone had a question about any HIPAA considerations, specifically about ESA letters and how much detail is required.
Yeah, maybe Stephen or others would like to jump in here. I did see that communication, and we talked about it a little bit in chat. And I think there's two things here. One is, we do want to always recognize that persons should be provided, kind of the utmost privacy rights. There are also persons who actually want a letter that actually defines and gives a specific diagnosis. And so I think the other thing to be aware of is that, the actual guidelines do require a formal diagnosis. And now whether that you place it in that letter and how, or whether there's multiple different types of letters that somebody might ultimately value, I think is an interesting conversation. But I've had a lot of clients who actually want to have people understand that they have a disability, sometimes referenced as an invisible disability. It's also one of the reasons why they place patches on a vest on their dog, because in many cases that identifies them as having a disability. So although I think we should always lean in the direction of protecting somebody's privacy, and that's the intention behind HIPAA guidelines, we also should be talking to the client themselves to find out what is it in fact that they are wanting and is most useful to them. Because in some of those cases that can be done that way.
And Phil, I think the letter that you showed is excellent. I don't think that goes too far. I've seen 4-page letters that go into detail about episodes and events in people's lives. And it's like, landlords don't need to know that.
Yeah.
But certainly to explain to the landlord through that letter that there's follow-up process and that they are continuing to be seen and to get feedback. And yeah, I think that's an excellent addition.
Great. And there was a couple of comments in there about a doctor refusing to write a letter because the dog wasn't, quote unquote, the correct breed to be an ESA. So I think that just speaks to, of course, the education that's needed. And who does need to be the one to write the ESA? Does it have to be a physician?
No, it doesn't. Actually, physicians are often the worst ones to do it. And they have virtually no training. They have prescription pads, which makes them think they should write prescriptions. But actually, I think the best persons to be doing these are persons who really understand, the issues facing that particular client, a clinician. It doesn't have to be a physician, however, a medical physician. It could be a counselor or a social worker. And they do have to be licensed, and that sort of thing. But I wanted to just share that there's been several cases now of systems, including entire universities, that have been sued over the failure to respond to and accommodate that person's right to this particular accommodation, and have had to pay out quite a lot of money. These are investigations that get done by the Justice Department, and then ultimately, I think, really just what Steve was talking about is that we've created this fear in practitioners of this that's probably inappropriate and not very even realistic, that it's not your job to evaluate the animal themselves. It's your job to evaluate whether your client would benefit from an animal in their life. And that's the limit of what you're saying. And you're not expected to be a behaviorist or a trainer or something. Now, in our program, we do choose to talk with the client about animal welfare and the benefits to having a good care plan, because that's when we believe the primary benefits occur, for that individual. So I think it's worth talking about those from the standpoint of just, creating a good likelihood for a successful outcome.
Great. All right, I have one in here for Diana. Can you please clarify whether waiver and estoppel, changing terms of tenancy, and retaliation are treated differently depending on state law?
It is. Each state is different, right? Each court, even in in the state of California, every county is different, because that goes to the imbalance of power of the court system and tenants that are unrepresented, because each judge is different. In the state of California, a jury trial is a constitutional right. Now, this is kind of getting a little bit past that question, but we demand a jury trial in every single one of our cases when there is an eviction process going on. Differently in the state of California, the state of New York, they have housing courts specifically for housing, right? We don't in California. So the laws are a little bit different in each state, but I think that being able to reach out to different legal aid organizations, or I'm happy to connect you to different legal aid organizations in different states to help navigate those issues. So they vary. So the answer is it depends, which is a very lawyerly answer. I'm sorry for that. But yeah.
Perfect. And there's another question about landlords stopping accepting a tenant's rent because they have pets, and kind of what that process would look like.
Yeah. So, I've had landlords, stopping to accept rent, not even for a pet, just to try to intimidate a tenant to move out. I think it's, that would be a form of retaliation. I always recommend to tenants to always save their rent. So put it aside. And if it's even taking out a money order, to leave that aside, screenshotting a copy of that money order to show that they had rent available on the day that the rent was due, so that should a landlord try to file a lawsuit against them for non-payment of rent, because that's what happens. They won't accept rent, and then they'll file a lawsuit for not paying rent. And you think what? That's crazy. Nope. Yes, it's crazy, but it's what happens. So those types of actions are retaliatory and are done to just intimidate the tenant. So that's why I stress again the importance of getting involved in tenants' rights organizations. It's kind of like an AA for tenants, because like a tenants anonymous, frankly, because once you share your story with other tenants, you're empowered by other tenants, and you know that you're not alone.
And Dianne, one of the things that landlords do is when they refuse to accept rent, the tenant doesn't understand that doesn't mean they don't owe the rent. And so they think, well, he wouldn't take my rent, so I went and, I paid some bills. And then they go to court and the judge says, that was unlawful. You have the right to stay there. Now pay your back rent. And the tenant says, what pet credit? They didn't take, I tried to give them my rent and they didn't take it. So then they get evicted, legitimately for non-payment of rent. And so it's a very pernicious thing that landlords do.
Very interesting. All right, so this is a question, I think for all three of you. How do we balance the want to help those who are experiencing instability in housing, who are being faced with giving up their animal unless they can get an ESA, with not watering down the concept of an ESA?
Well, I'll go. I guess somebody said early in a session that every animal is an emotional support animal, and I do think that's true. And and in addition to having no pet housing, if we could have animal-friendly everything, then I think that would solve a lot of problems. But I don't know that there's an answer to that. I think the fair housing laws, as Dianne has said, is case by case, and it's evaluated on the facts of each case. So I guess that's really the best that we can hope for.
Yeah, I would agree, Steve, with you that, this is a chance for us to find our common ground. Is that, there's over 300 million companion animals living in people's homes. More than half of them sleep on people's beds every night because they sleep better. Many of us get home and our favorite time of day is being greeted by our companion animals. And you can go out to the garage and come back in 2 seconds later and they'll do it again, right? And that you're always welcome at home as a feature of these relationships. And, none of us worry about our pets getting on our computers, late at night trying to find a new owner, right? And those sorts of things. That these are some of the most trusting and reliable relationships. And they come in all different shapes and sizes. I've met people who have had goldfish as emotional support animals. So we have to pull our judgment out of this and provide perspective that these are support systems. And what the science is saying, this is what Steve, I think, was getting at in his presentation, the science of the human-animal bond suggests that social support doesn't have to be a human. It can be a non-human. And that when we open our minds to that possibility and take judgment out of it, then we should be able to provide lots of different ways to provide this kind of support.
Yeah. And I'll just jump in really quickly and just add to, in terms of the, I come from housing as a human right model. And I think that, the difficulty with, with watering down of the fair housing laws is at the end of the day, kind of like Steve was saying, our goal is to be able to have all pet friendly housing. Frankly, for me, the goal is to be able to make sure that housing is a human right for humans and their pets. And so I think that the more that we are advocating to dismantle what is this notion of property rights and to really, force our legislators to understand that, 50% of our income shouldn't be going towards rent, right? That is bananas, that we're all on board to understanding that housing is a human right, will then be able to help us to not have watered down fair housing laws, right? I mean, the reason we have fair housing laws is because of the notion of property rights. So just kind of advocating for that bigger vision of, housing as a human right helps the people and the person and the pet.
Great. And we have just a few minutes left. I have one comment here I just want to read. I just think there's less of a gap between these two groups than we might expect. So those experiencing instability and have a diagnosed disability, as these folks are likely to also possibly be dealing with things that could indicate a DSM diagnosis, and as always worth investigating. And then we also have someone who's just, of course, reiterating that there is a difference between ESAs and service animals, and that service animals are provided, different protections under the law, needing to, perform a specific task related to a disability. I don't know if that's anything that you guys would like to speak to, or could just kind of for our audience do a brief 101 of the difference.
No, Dianne could cover, but I mean, there isn't really a difference in housing between a service animal and an emotional support animal. They're both fully protected and have to be accommodated. It's public accommodation that only recognizes dogs and miniature horses and doesn't recognize any other animal as a service animal, even if they're specially trained, which I think is a horrible interpretation of the law. But the fair housing laws are much broader, and they do recognize, and I don't think there is really a difference, is there, between a service animal and a support?
Oh, I don't know, Philip, if you were going to jump in or.
No, go ahead, Dianne.
Oh, I mean, I was just, in terms of housing laws in, the state of California, they're still protected, right? So support animals aren't going to be treated differently than service animals in the housing context period.
Great, thank you for clarifying. Okay, and we just have about a minute and a half left. She says, thank you for the clarification. And we have one question for Dianne. We have heard from housing people that if legislation puts too much restriction on landlords, more individuals will leave the market.
My thoughts on that. So great in what I say. I believe in social housing. I think that we should start investing in community land trusts, that we should start investing in cooperatives. I think that so long as there are landlords that exist, we should all be landlords. Market rent housing is unaffordable. Rent is not affordable. So if landlords want to leave the housing market, bye, developers. See you later. Okay, because we need to start making housing affordable and housing a human right. So that's what I say to that. As you can tell, I am very much pro housing for everyone. If we don't have housing, we don't have our health. If we don't have our health, we can't work and contribute to society. So that's my thoughts on that.
Great. Thank you. That's a really good way to end. And everyone is screaming this in the chat. Totally agree. Thank you all so much. This was really informative and enjoyable. And we'll see you all back in the main room for some storytelling, and then we'll close out the conference.